Cherie, thanks so much for making time to talk to me this morning.
Thanks, Micaela. I'm really excited about the chat.
Yeah, it's good to catch up after so long. So, Cherie, you've done a whole bunch of really interesting things. I still think of you as a young person. What you were talking about you writing a letter from your younger self, I was thinking, I still think of you as young and full of energy and ideas. You've worked for the Victorian State Government. You've worked for a range of different community service organisations, both in Australia, in child protection and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but also internationally. And I'm curious to hear a bit more about that work and how some of that work has influenced you. But the other thing I noticed, and part of the reason I reached out to you, was you've just started doing a podcast as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I keep thinking I'm still young too. I keep thinking that, and I think what's happened is, I've had my 2 kids, and I feel like I've been out of the kind of energy that I was in when I was doing all of that kind of work that you just explained then. And so the podcast was really a creative project of mine that came out of a workshop, actually, where we were exploring the future of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforces in the human services field, because we make such a big part of that workforce, and it's a growing. And I remember I was standing in there and someone said, oh, but what if all the Aboriginal people become extinct? And as a scenario, and I can remember sitting there going, oh, this extinction narrative has been around my whole life. And I really wanted to create a podcast that showed how our culture always has had foresight embedded in it. And so I wanted to create a podcast that had a future lens to it, that gave voice to Indigenous visions of the future, but also other unheard voices around futures thinking and the way that we think about the future and understand time and the past and that kind of thing, to sort of challenge some of those narratives, like the extinction narrative, the ancient, that we're only belonging this ancient past kind of thing. But our adaptability is proven in terms of being one of the oldest living cultures in the world. So it's like, I'm going to do a podcast about that and ensure that kind of futures thinking is expressed. Yeah. So I don't know how to do podcasting. I've just done a podcast course. So it's all about new skills at the moment. I thought by 40 I would be, more of kind of consolidating and moving forward all my skills, but I feel like I'm just hitting sort of beginner mode again.
I think that's one of the fantastic things about working with you, is that your energy is always learning and always thinking about things in an opening up way, rather than I know it all now and I'm the expert sharing it. So I'm sure the other thing I didn't mention was that you're currently teaching. I'm sure you're a fantastic teacher. And I'm curious, you've just talked a few times about futures thinking. Can you explain a bit about what futures thinking is and how you think it can be useful at this time of such incredible ambiguity and uncertainty?
Yeah, I think futures thinking in times like we're currently in can be very difficult, because there's a lot of anxiety, there's narratives about the future that can dominate. So, for example, the end of the world narratives, or however people are making sense of what's happening now and what they think it means tomorrow. And a part of futures thinking is about how we use the future space, the idea of the future, as an active space to work in, because sometimes the present can feel very thick and very overwhelming and very heavy. Whereas when we talk about the future, it can really open up space about the assumptions that we're making right now in this time and place. And often when we unpack those assumptions, we realise if we change some of those, it opens up more future possibilities. And the more alternative kind of imaginings that we can have about the future, whether it's around the future post-pandemic or bushfires with what's going on, the more kind of ideas we can generate, the more options we have, and the more sense of agency and empowered people we can have. Whereas when you've got kind of one dominant narrative that might be saying, that I can never say this word, is it apocalyptic? Is it
I can't say it either.
Well, you know that word. Yeah, when you've got that as a dominant narrative, or even the business as usual narrative, you know, and people can feel that, well, actually, it doesn't feel like business as usual anymore. And people are waiting for this. When things go back to normal, there's a new kind of normal. And so how do we actually get into a headspace where we can provide those safe spaces for people to imagine, to be able to deal with the uncertainty, bring the anxiety down around the uncertainty a little bit? So especially times like this, not everyone is in a position where they have the privilege to be able to reflect or be creative in times like this, because it's a real crisis time. So I feel like people that are in that position, to create space to be able to do that for yourself and to be able to listen and create that space for others by just listening to someone who might not be in a better situation than you, can really allow for some of the ideas to emerge. So for me, I'm really interested in science fiction at the moment. And I did some work at the Indigenous Comic-Con, which I think is the most beautiful space that's been created by Kina Muir, because it's a real imaginative play space. And I feel like for a lot of Indigenous people, a lot of the sort of things that get set up around consultations and things like that, they're always about the problems and the issues and how to solve them. Whereas I feel like this space he's created is just this really beautiful, imaginative, expressive play space. And for me, it was a really healing space to be there. And one of the futures games we played there was to deal out different elements of a future to attendees who came along, and attendees were from more different backgrounds, and I would deal them out a different element of a future. So I said, okay, the mood of your future is going to be anxious, or it's going to be respectful, or it's going to be whatever the mood may be. And then in your future, you're going to have this object and this sort of terrain. So there's going to be a lot of water in your future, or a lot of women, or whatever the terrain might be. Then they could create an image. So they would create an image about that future, or a story about a legend from that future. And it was really beautiful, because I can remember one 12-year-old girl was there and she kept saying, deal me another future, you know. So I'd deal her another future, she'll do another image. And then the stories would just connect, and it ended up being like narrative foresight. So you're creating stories from the future. And some of the stories were really ugly and scary and monsters and zombies and all this kind of stuff. And then as they kept going, they still might have been about that, but there was all this really empowered stuff going on in the stories as well. So we're in the information age, but I really feel like there's this really beautiful dreaming story space. I feel like people are really craving new stories, and they're looking for leadership in those stories, or looking for themselves in those stories. So that's where I feel like I'm kind of drawn to at the moment. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm curious about your journey to this place and your leadership journey, because you've just talked about people looking and finding themselves. And how did you find yourself here? What was your journey and some of the elements that brought you to this place?
Yeah. Okay. I was never someone that set out with a very clear intention of what I wanted to do or what I wanted to achieve. And I always felt weird about that, because I felt like, you know, whenever you talk to coaching people and that, they're like, what's your goal and 5-year plans? And I'm like, oh, I've just
I remember having that conversation with you.
I've always gone with my gut. And I did social work because I thought that's broad and that'll always be handy, because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. But a lot of what I've done is through, I guess, my personal journey and my intuition. And so at times felt very lost in my journey, to be honest, but had led me to very complex and a lot of movement across sectors, you know, and I always wondered if that was the wrong thing in a way, or not the right way to do things. But when I look back at even just my whole life, it was always full of movement. It had a lot of, you know, cultural diversity in terms of a Yorta Yorta woman. My mum's Yorta Yorta, but I was raised by a Torres Strait Islander father in my early years, and we moved a lot. And so that movement and constantly being exposed to different perspectives really shaped how I work, because I was constantly felt like I was in this sort of listening space of watching multiple and building multiple perspectives. But the most transformative, I guess, part of my journey was when I was in my 20s, my early 20s, and I had been working for Oxfam on an international youth program, and I was running the Indigenous Caucus at this event where we would bring 300 young people from 90 different countries together for 8 days, or between the ages of 18 to 25. And it was run by all the people running the program were in their 20s themselves. And so I remember at the Indigenous Caucus, it was just a space where anyone who I'd self-identified could come to. And I had both the Israeli and Palestinians show up, and they said, they're not the Indigenous one, I am. And the other one's going, you're not Indigenous, choose who should stay and who should go. And I remember just standing there going, ugh, and looking over at the fellow that was with me, who was helping me out in the space, and he just looked at me and he goes, you come have a yarn with me, he said to the Israeli guy, and the Palestinian, there was 3 young Palestinian people there, and they were like, people take us out of our countries and they think we're going to just talk about the issues and then we go back right into them and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And no one comes and sees our reality. And I was like, I'll come. And I can remember saying, I'll come, thinking, did I just say I'm coming there? And I just remember when I said it, it was like I didn't say it. I knew I was going to go there. And I remember quitting Oxfam to go there, to go and listen to the young people at the time that were there. And I remember thinking, what am I doing? I don't know this place. I have no connections to this place. What am I doing? So I had gone there for 3 months. And while we were there, we had created this idea for a program. And so when I'd come back, I'd put this proposal in saying, can we take young people from around the world and do this program where we walk the realities of young people from all different areas, you know, within that place. And they approved it. And I can remember sitting at home thinking, I don't actually know how to do this. I have no idea how I'm going to make this happen. And it was very weird because I was sort of contracted on to do it. So because Oxfam Australia at the time didn't work in the Middle East. So they had said, we're going to support you to do it, but we can't really do anything for you once you're there. But, you know, Oxfam Great Britain's there, maybe they can help you out. So I was sort of in this weird contracted position to do it. And anyway, so I was sitting at home really overwhelmed, thinking I actually am going to pull the plug because I don't feel like I have the skills. I don't feel like I have the capacity to kind of make it happen. But I also had this weird tension of there were so many things going on in Australia, in my own country, my own community, and as an Aboriginal person, feeling like I should be, you know, working with my own people. And for many years I'd been doing that. I'd been trying to ensure Aboriginal kids remained connected to country, and that was a really big part of my journey because my mum had been stolen, Jen. So I was really in this torn, like, why am I going over to this other place? So that was kind of the predicament. I felt like I was in this really time of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. I didn't know whether to jump into it. And then I got this call off my cousin, and she goes, her name's Robin. She rings me up and she goes, hey, Cherie, you're the only one we know that's been to that place, that Israel place or that Palestine place. And I was like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, what is it? And she said, well, your great-great-granduncle, William Cooper, he led a movement in 1938 to protest what was happening on the night of the broken glass in Germany. And he was protesting what was happening to the Jews. And he walked 10 kilometres from Footscray to the German consulate, took this letter. And this is like 2 generations later. They didn't accept the letter at the time, but then it just seemed to happen right at this time that the Jewish community here in Australia wanted to recognise what he did. And he now has something in his honour at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. But that night I went there, and I can remember standing in the room listening to the story and talking to Uncle Boydie and his grandson, and I got really overwhelmed with emotion because it's like we always know our ancestors are sort of, you know, with us and have guided the way for us, but it's almost like an ancestor showed up right at this pivotal point to say to me, Cherie, you will always be there for your people. That's what we've always done, and you will always do that, but we're here for all of humanity and we stand for everyone, and this is your path. Yes, take other Aboriginal young people and other young people from all around the world to broaden their minds, to see what's happening in the world. It's important to know. and you can do it. That was like kind of what happened that night. And because of that connection, I did go. I met with the Israeli ambassador to Australia within Tel Aviv when I got there. And they put on a big party for all these young change makers to meet other diplomats from around. We got onto army bases in Israel to understand what young Israelis go through. We were in refugee camps. We walked each other's worlds, and it was a very confronting journey and a high-risk journey in many ways with some of the things that we faced. But yeah, I can just remember it really transformed me in terms of understanding myself and coming to terms with what I thought my role or what's expected of me versus owning my own journey, and being strong enough to stand in that. So I feel like that's probably one of the biggest, realizing that I'd had a lot of access. My job at Oxfam allowed me to really broaden my own understanding of the world, and my giving back was to provide others with those kinds of opportunities and to share that knowledge. Whereas before I felt like guilty almost for having that access in a way and not knowing what to do with it. So it was about learning to share the knowledge and create space, all of those sorts of things. And that's an ongoing journey. That's not something that you learn once and you got it. It's something that it's a constant journey there. Yeah, but it was very powerful for me at that time, and to really trust, even when you don't know. Another little weird thing happened on that journey. I ran into this is going to sound bizarre because it sounds like I've made it up, but it's so bizarre that even I still can't get my head around it. I ran into another uncle in Jerusalem who just happened to be in Jerusalem for a conference on how Christianity had sort of wiped out culture in a way. So they're looking at why can't you play, Yiddiki and all that in the churches, that kind of stuff. And he just happened to be there while I was there and gave me another connection, who then got me connected to a person in the Israeli Ministry of Tourism whose wife just happened to be Australian, who then wrote me this big sort of invitation for the program to help us get the visas. And I remember and this was a completely different connection. So it's not my Yorta connection. This was through the Minniecon side of my family personal story that showed up as well. So it was like, wow, sometimes you've just got to take the leap and trust that things that are and maybe that's a very spiritual way of looking at it, but that's just how I am and how I've worked. And it's always sort of worked out for me in that way. Whenever I've gone against my intuition or instinct, it's never played out well.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you. That's kind of one of my leadership lessons has been, and what I'm hearing you talk about is listening and being open to opportunity, being brave and a bit of a creative risk taker, which is how I know you, Cherie. And I've really valued the opportunity I had to work with you. And I'm really curious to see what you're doing now. And I'd love to keep talking, but we need to finish up. But what I would love to do, if it's all right, is share, when we share this vlog, we'll share the details of your podcast in the newsletter, if that's okay.
Well, I haven't launched it yet. So
okay.
You know what I do? I've told enough. This is another thing that you do. You tell people you're doing something and you tell them enough, then you actually do it.
There you go. Well, you're going to have to do one soon so we can share it in our newsletter when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time today.
No problem. It was great.